I know there are a lot of people who have not filed taxes, and I know there are a bunch of folks that haven't filed taxes. I'm one of them. I'm not a bad guy, but I have a wife and kids, and it takes all the money I got to support them. I didn't know the IRS could file tax returns for me and then come after me for the taxes. I don't have the money that's owed. I'm going nuts trying to figure out what to do, so what can I do to handle this?
This is a very interesting question because it brings up a moral issue. We have a taxpayer here who can't afford to pay his taxes and may not even be able to afford to file the returns and pay an accountant to prepare the returns. And he's struggling to meet the basic necessities of life for his family, his wife and children. Obviously, there's some sort of social contract that we all have as citizens with society to pay our taxes to make sure there's a safety net. But not only is there a social contract, there's also a family contract. This taxpayer wants to make sure he can provide for his family. What these types of taxpayers need to understand is that they're one of millions and millions of people who have a tax problem. There's about 17 million non-filers out there. And what I recommend to people in this situation is go and get those returns filed anyway. Don't be a non-filer, because if you're a non-filer with the IRS, you tend to get driven into the underground economy. You can't have a bank account. You can't have a regular wage-paying job. It's difficult to get 1099 income because the IRS, if you don't file returns, will file returns for you on your behalf, assess you a tax, and then try and collect it. And that creates a very tough economic situation for taxpayers. What this taxpayer can do is file the missing returns, try and do it as effectively and economically as possible. Once the tax is assessed, there's a whole host of options this taxpayer can employ to resolve that underlying tax issue. This taxpayer can then do an offer in compromise, an installment arrangement, or a hardship status. And if they enter any one of those programs with the IRS, then they can have a bank account and not worry about bank levies. They can have a job and not worry about wage garnishments. They can own property and not worry about property seizures. So these taxpayers got to move back into the system, and that's really what the IRS wants most. They're more interested in taxpayers coming back into the system now than they are in how they're going to pay the total tax due. The IRS is bound by the Internal Revenue Manual. And the Internal Revenue Manual is the guide that the IRS uses to process tax cases. And there's a lot of programs in that Internal Revenue Manual that allow taxpayers to get back on their feet and get back into society. An individual with a wife and kids that's trying to support a family cannot afford to be in the underground economy. And especially with the electronic age, it's so much harder to hide and live off of cash than it used to be. We're in a very electronic environment now, and it's only going to get more aggressive as time goes on. So to file his old returns, what this taxpayer needs to do is two things. First of all, he needs to call the IRS, and you can call the IRS right up at 1-800-829-1040. Call the IRS at that number, ask for his record of accounts, ask for his income transcripts. Even if he doesn't understand those two documents, he can take those documents to any qualified accountant or tax lawyer, and they can prepare the missing returns, file those returns, and then this case moves out of an assessment non-filer situation into a straight collection issue where the case can actually be dealt with and eventually resolved.
Well, you know, Sam, what we come up with more and more and more as people have questions on dealing with the IRS is 100% of the time when the IRS suddenly becomes aware of you, about your only option is to talk to them. Get that particular issue dealt with, because once the IRS becomes aware of you and maybe they file tax returns for you, which they can do, maybe they're looking at your returns, they're not going to go away. You have to take action. And there are ways you can solve any problem you've got. I do want to talk just a tiny bit about some of these tax resolution companies, because as doing this program with Sam, I've become very aware of the kind of advertising that's going on out there. There is no magic bullet to solve an IRS problem. You have to deal with it. And quite frankly, some of the companies' advertising is about a quarter inch away from just absolute fraud. It's almost frightening. It's taken advantage of people's fear.
Yeah, unfortunately, fear is a powerful motivator, and a lot of these unscrupulous companies are out there making false promises, trying to get clients through the door, and that's a very unfortunate situation. In essence, they're preying on the weakest of society, which isn't obviously a good thing to do. But getting back to this taxpayer who's been a multiple-year non-filer, what's interesting is that sometimes in my law firm we see taxpayers who come in who haven't filed returns for 10, 20 years. And in one sense, I don't want to call them like winners in the tax game, but ultimately they probably may only have to go back and file 3, 4, 5, 6 years of tax returns. They don't have to go back and file 15, 20 years of tax returns. The IRS isn't looking for those very, very old tax returns. They're looking to get these taxpayers back in compliance, and oftentimes just filing 3 years of returns is enough. So these taxpayers shouldn't have too much anxiety or fear to do that. Getting back to your point about tax resolution companies, you're absolutely correct. There's no magic tax dust or a wand that somebody's figured out. All the programs and all the rules that are employed to fix a tax problem are right there in the Internal Revenue Manual, and no one entity or organization has greater access or greater application of the rules to the IRS. So when a taxpayer is out there looking for somebody to help them fix a tax problem, they should try and find the most competent, affordable, and educated representation out there. They should call around and definitely look up the firm's reputation on the internet. All this information is very available now. They got to do some research.